Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. A book published recently contains a revealing analysis of Hindutva and its majoritarian mistreatment of Muslims. And here's the book. It's called Our Hindu Rashtra, and its author is the well-known journalist and columnist Akar Patel. Joining me now to talk about his book and his revealing insight into Hindutva is Akar Patel himself. Akar Patel, your book is a comprehensive and compelling account about how India is steadily becoming a majoritarian state. But you begin by pointing out that unlike our neighbors who are majoritarian because that is how their constitution has defined them, India is majoritarian through existing law and policy, and above all, through the issues that parties and governments picked and stayed focused on till the majoritarian impact was achieved. So we are majoritarian through the back door. Does that mean we're less majoritarian than, say, Pakistan and Afghanistan? Or does that simply not apply?
So we need to ask ourselves what it is that majoritarianism has sought to achieve in those places. And it seems to be two things. First is the exclusion of minorities from power. Second, using the state as an instrument to actively harass them. Both of those conditions obtain in India as truly as they do elsewhere in South Asia. And I would say that we are no less a majoritarian than those states.
So you are saying that India is as majoritarian as Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the view that many in India have, that we are different because our constitution is secular, is mistaken.
Yes, there is no Hindu chief minister in Pakistan's 4 states. There is no Muslim chief minister in our 28 states. In 15 states in this country, there is no Muslim minister at all. In 10 states, there is one minister usually given the minority affairs. This is deliberate exclusion of 200 million people. And the second point about the state being used as an instrument to brutalize minorities is as true in our country as it is in the rest of South Asia. If one looks at laws like those on love jihad, cow slaughter, the NRC, triple talaq, and so on.
Now, your book points out that the driving force behind India's majoritarianism is Hindutva. But you also say Hindutva is not an ideology, it is better understood as a prejudice, in particular an anti-minority prejudice, and more specifically an anti-Muslim prejudice. Briefly, can you explain why you see Hindutva as prejudice rather than ideology?
Classically speaking, ideologies are defined as doctrines of economic or political theory. So socialists would see a larger role for the state. Conservatives would seek a smaller role for the state. We have to ask ourselves what it is that Hindutva seeks to achieve. And they've never had any sort of consistency in their economic policies. They were very socialist from the 50s to the 90s. They were liberalizers in the 90s. Now we seem to have gone back to a certain sort of socialism again with Atmanirbharta. There is no consistency. What has remained on the board has been the demand made of Muslims that they should give up their mosque, that they should give up their personal laws, that they should give up the autonomy that they have in Kashmir. Of late, more things have come. Give up beef, be excluded from CA, line up to show your citizenship. These are the things that actually define the party rather than any other broad ideology.
In fact, you take this point further in your book when you say that the core of Hindutva is the ambition to create Hindu Rashtra. But you add, Hindu Rashtra is not a theory of state, it's not a change in the constitution. Instead, you write, Hindu Rashtra is purely about the exclusion and persecution of India's minorities, particularly Muslims. That is the only meaning of Hindu Rashtra in India. It imagines India as a Hindu nation where the Muslim and Christian exist on sufferance. That is all there is to Hindu Rashtra.
Yes, so the BJP or the RSS has not given us a definition of what those two words mean. They use those two words, but they don't tell us what they mean. Nepal was Hindu Rashtra till 2008. Why was it that? It was because executive power in that country flowed from a Kshatriya king, and he was guided by Brahmins in his court. It was Hindu Rashtra only to that extent. It didn't ask Shudras to stop studying. It didn't give the Vash the entire economy and so on, because those things cannot be done in the world of 2020. India does not have a hereditary Kshatriya king. So even that limited route that Nepal had is actually closed for us. On the other hand, the BJP swears by secularism. So it says that in its own constitution that it swears by secularism and socialism. It requires party members to take an oath that they believe in it. The fact is that it doesn't need to change anything to allow it to do what it wants, and we have seen that. This is the 7th year that we've got a BJP a majority. We've seen no move towards a change in either the state or the laws.
Okay, you take this point in your book one critical step further. You write, and I'm quoting you, the acquisition of authority in Hindu Rashtra is not towards bettering the lives of Hindus, but damaging, excluding, and handicapping those who are not born Hindu. So the aim of Hindu Rashtra is the persecution of non-Hindu minorities. If the BJP were to turn around and say this is just Akar Patel's personal prejudice, which flows from his dislike of either the term Hindu Rashtra or our party, how would you respond to that criticism?
I would say that majoritarianism usually expresses itself in two ways. One is in the positive sense, where you say we will do something for the majority community that will change and better their lives. So the route that Pakistan took at the beginning was that they would change their laws and they would align the criminal code with Sharia. They would chop hands for theft. They would lash people for fornication. They would force people to fast in Ramzan. They would force the debits of zakat from the banks. They would ban interest. All of that failed. They tried that with the assumption that if they were to become a more pure society, a more pious society, they would get blessings. What remained in that country was the second part to majoritarianism, which is the brutalization of minorities, the Ahmadis, the Hindus, Christians, and the Shia. In India, there was never anything offered on the positive sense. For instance, the BJP could have said that reservations for Dalits and the Adivasis would now be extended into the private sector. They chose not to do that. The only thing that they have is the active persecution through law and through practice of Muslims. If we look at the focus that the government has had and what has kept it busy, even on the foreign affairs front, to a large extent, has been the laws and the practices that they have followed, which have gone after our Muslim community.
So what you're saying in a nutshell is that Indian majoritarianism, particularly under the BJP, has not acted to improve the lives of the majority so much as act to persecute, harass, exclude, and minimize the minorities, and particularly the Muslims.
Yes, there is no program of work that they have which is aimed at the weaker sections, even within the Hindu society. It's purely about driving every week, every month legislation that seeks to marginalize, that seeks to brutalize minorities, especially Muslims.
You make one further point about Hindu Rashtra, and this time it comes towards the end of your book. You say Hindutva has captured the Indian state, but it sits behind the facade of Nehruvian secularism and inclusion. It pretends to be what it is not. In other words, Hindutva never reveals itself in its full light. It's either sometimes in disguise or even sometimes deceptive.
Yes, so the absence of any form of real ideology means that it doesn't know how to present itself once the hatred of a Muslim is removed. The diplomat defending India on beef lynchings, on love jihad, on CAA in Washington or in Brussels pretends that nothing has really changed under the BJP and that the constitution is secular, the judiciary is sort of independent, and what is happening is merely aberration. But so this is where the contradiction comes into play, because the last year they've had to defend things that are not actually aberrations. And it is absolutely true to say that while Hindutva has followed a particular line within this country, it pretends to be something that it is not outside.
In other words, the aberrations are fast becoming the norm. Now, your book looks at many varied and different ways in which Hindutva has targeted Muslims and the interests of Muslims to show that in independent India, the vast majority of our system is loaded against Muslims. I want to take up 2 or 3 of those examples with you. To begin with, you say the BJP repeatedly insists that there is what they call appeasement of Muslims. The facts you point out, no matter which sphere of life you look at, clearly show that Muslim representation is just a fraction of its proportion of the population. For example, they should have 74 seats in the Lok Sabha, but they have only 27. They are nearly 15% of the population, but only 4.9% of state and central government employees, 4.6% of the paramilitaries, 3.2% of the IAS, IAFS, and the police services, and perhaps as low as just 1% of the army. Are Muslims being deliberately and consciously left out? Or is this because Muslims, for whatever reason of their own intimidation and hesitation, are reluctant to join the mainstream? Which of the two?
They are deliberately excluded in 2 ways. The first is through democratic politics. There is no Muslim amongst the ruling party's 303 Lok Sabha MPs. There was no Muslim in its last 282 seat a majority either. There is, by my reckoning, one Muslim MLA in the BJP out of over 1,200 nationwide. That's the deputy speaker in Assam. What the BJP does is that its politics is driven primarily against India's own citizens. And this shows and is shown to Muslims really clearly that we don't want you and we are going to exclude you. The second form of exclusion is through state policy. For example, RAW does not hire a Muslim and has never had. So in these 2 ways, through democratic politics and through state policy, India deliberately excludes Muslims.
One of the most horrifying examples in your book of the way in which Muslims are excluded is what's called Gujarat's Disturbed Areas Act. To be honest, the vast majority of Indians don't know what this act is. They've never even heard of it. But you point out in your book that it's existed for 35 years, and you say its aim is to keep Muslims out of other neighborhoods than those traditionally Muslim. In other words, its aim is to ghettoize Muslims. Can you explain this act and how it works?
The government of Gujarat decides the people of which religion can buy a property where. The buyer and seller don't have that right. So Muslims are denied a permission to buy in the areas where they are not wanted. These areas, they are notified as being disturbed. They are part of every city. More are actually added each year. Each year it becomes more difficult for Muslims to get out of their ghettos. The government determines where it is that they can live. Foreigners can buy properties in parts of Gujarat where Gujarati Muslims cannot.
In other words, Hindus in Gujarat ensure that Muslims do not buy properties through the Disturbed Area Acts. If a Muslim is well enough to buy a property in a Hindu majority area, that sale can be contradicted or countermanded on the grounds of the Disturbed Area Act, thus ensuring that Hindu areas remain largely, if not entirely, Hindu.
Yes, this happens actively. It happens regularly. BJP legislators insist that their own constituencies and parts of them be brought under the law. They do it all the time. Neighbors often, and this is reported in the media regularly, do not want the property next to theirs to be sold to a Muslim.
And in fact, over the 35 years that this act has been in operation, the number of areas, the expanse of land that it covers keeps increasing. It's not just limited to Ahmedabad, it exists in other areas. And secondly, more and more areas of Ahmedabad have fallen under its remit.
Yes, all the cities of the state, and within those cities, more and more neighborhoods.
Now, for many, perhaps, the most disillusioning example of the way Muslims are excluded by the Indian system emerges from your chapter on the Supreme Court. You point out that, first of all, there are bewildering judgments from the Supreme Court that have argued that Om is not a religious symbol, that Hinduism is not a religion but a way of life. Then, in 2019, the Supreme Court delivered the Babri Masjid judgment, where after readily accepting that the demolition was illegal and wrong, it still went on to actually give the site to the very people who demolished the masjid. And then most recently, there is the Supreme Court's deliberate, repeated reluctance to speedily take up critical constitutional issues like the change of status in Jammu and Kashmir or the Citizenship Amendment Act. And you write, I'm quoting you, the conclusion of this writer and others is that the judiciary is pliant in India. It sides with the majoritarian view. Are you suggesting that actually even the top court has buckled under Hindutva pressure?
Freedom of religion that was constitutionally guaranteed was taken away by the Supreme Court in 1977. Uttarakhand High Court forced the state to legislate a love jihad law. The love jihad conspiracy began from a Kerala High Court's judge. Cow slaughter was banned after the Supreme Court, and the judgment said that the Chief Justice was taking into account not the Constitution but Hindu sentiment. The burden of proof on people in the NRC was reversed in Assam by Guwahati High Court. People were jailed without crime or trial on the orders of Chief Justice Gogoi. The habeas corpus that you mentioned in Kashmir went undecided till the state itself released the people. The Supreme Court did not step in on a matter of habeas of former chief ministers for months. This does not happen in common law nations. CAA's constitutionality has still not been heard. The list of wrongs by the judiciary is quite long, and I would say that it is conclusive that it is complicit. I would use that word.
You're saying something that is going to be shocking for people, but undoubtedly it is the truth. In many of the instances you've quoted, steps that have been taken either to prevent so-called love jihad or to enforce what ironically is called freedom of religion, but is actually anti-conversion, were initiated by indications of pressure or suggestions that came from the judiciary, from local high courts. Does this then suggest, and this is, I suppose, the critical question, that there are many in the Indian judiciary who share the anti-minority, specifically the anti-Muslim sentiment that underlies Hindutva? Do our judges share that prejudice as well?
Absolutely. They have no way to inoculate themselves against what the rest of society feels or says, and that has shown in its conduct. People might not know that Indians have no freedom of religion. You can't change your faith. You have to make an application, and the government determines whether or not it will let you do that. The Catholic Church in Gujarat has stopped baptizing people because it fears that the harassment from the VHP and from the state itself is so high that it doesn't want to get into something that it was founded for. All of this is the result of the complicity of the Supreme Court and of the rest of the judiciary, in which many people who have studied what they have done, including me, have no faith.
Let me at this point put to you the picture that's emerging. India has a secular constitution, but our judges, in terms of their individual personalities and temperament, our politicians, particularly those of the BJP, in terms of their predilections and prejudices, within that overall secular constitution, actually find ways of policy or of sheer prejudice or of administration to harass and persecute minorities. So we may claim in constitutional terms to be secular, but our practice, our administration, our policies are all designed to push our minorities to the margins, to exclude them, to persecute them, to harass them. Is that the correct impression?
Absolutely. I would say that it's been done in a devious fashion, that the constitution has been stood on its head, that the so-called reasonable restrictions on the fundamental rights have become bigger than the rights themselves. And most of it is targeted at the minorities.
And this is a direct result of the influence of Hindutva and the so-called desire to create a Hindu Rashtra. This is why you say Hindutva is a prejudice, not an ideology.
Absolutely. And I would say that it precedes the BJP, that a lot of things that are majoritarian in the constitution, those fires were lit by people who were Congress members in the Constituent Assembly, who might have been Congress voters and judges later. And even today, I would suggest that the prejudices that we hold are not limited to those who vote for the BJP.
Let's come at this point to two campaigns that are happening almost every day at the moment: Love Jihad and the so-called anti-cow slaughter campaign. Of Love Jihad, you write in your book, Hindutva created this narrative, spread the theory, encouraged the violence that surrounds it. Of the anti-cow slaughter campaign, you write, the laws exist primarily to victimize and brutalize Muslims, who are the majority of people in the butchery trade. And to me, this suggests that even though we've pushed Muslims to the very margins of our society, we still continue to harass them. We still, or rather Hindutva still, wants to ensure they cannot lead a peaceful life.
There is no end. There is no goal. And it's just this and more of the same. Deen Dayal Upadhyay said that the goal was the political defeat of Muslims. They don't have anything else. Even after being confronted by data that shows how marginalized Muslims are, they will continue to use words like appeasement. The facts will not change what it is that they believe in. What they want is active brutalization of our own citizens, and this is what they will continue to do.
It's not just that Hindutva wants to ensure the political defeat of Muslims, which from the statistics you quoted earlier, it's abundantly clear they've succeeded. Muslims are hardly part of our democratic system. There are no Muslim chief ministers, as you pointed out. But in addition, Hindutva also wants to exclude them socially.
So in large parts of Gujarat, you will find, as we have discussed, neighborhoods that have been permanently segregated. There is no meaningful space in which Muslim children can actually interact with Hindus. What they're doing is dividing this society at the neighborhood level, at the level of law and policy. This exclusion is all that they have, and they will push for more of the same.
We're coming to the end of this interview. I want to ask you two specific questions in particular. First, does our Prime Minister Narendra Modi share and believe in this anti-Muslim prejudice? Does he oppose it? Or does he turn an opportunistic political blind eye to it? What's your feeling? What's your sense?
So, in the years that he was in power, he never gave a ticket to a Muslim, either for Lok Sabha or for the Vidhan Sabha in Gujarat. We can take a look at that data. Beef lynching as a category of violence came into India after 2015, when Mr. Modi pushed for a ban. Maharashtra, Haryana then passed laws, and the murders began after that. He has rewarded those who abuse Muslims, Niranjan Jyoti, Giriraj Singh, those who have instigated violence against Muslims, Kapil Mishra, Anurag Thakur, remain. I think we can safely conclude that Mr. Modi not only condones it, he encourages it, I would say.
You really are saying that the Prime Minister of India, who's sworn an oath on the Constitution, who's there to uphold secularism, encourages prejudice against Muslims?
That is what the record shows, yes.
In other words, Mr. Modi's record reveals the truth regardless of what he may say rhetorically.
This is a fact.
This, I have to point out, will invite on you the wrath of BJP supporters and trolls. You do realize that, don't you?
One cannot run away from what one has found in terms of facts. And I think that my book sufficiently shows what I have said to be true.
Finally, there is another question your book throws up, although I don't think it's one that your book addresses because it goes beyond the remit of your book. Does the political success of Hindutva, particularly since 2014, suggest that a large number, maybe a majority of Indians share the anti-Muslim antipathy and prejudice that lies at the heart of Hindutva?
We are in the seventh year of this government, and I think that's a long enough period to be able to assess it. We are in the 12th quarter of a decline in GDP growth, that's 36 months. We were at record unemployment before the lockdown. We are now in we are in a recession. The NSSO data shows that we were already poorer and eating less in 2018 than we were over 2014. This is government data. Globally, we have slipped on several indicators. 24 places on the democracy index, on the human development index, as we learned last month, we have fallen 6 places on the freedom index, 4 on gender, corruption.
But can I interrupt? Come back, Akar Patel, to the specific question I asked. Does the success of Hindutva, the political success of Hindutva since 2014 suggest that a large number of Indians, maybe a majority, share the anti-Muslim prejudice that lies at the heart of Hindutva?
It's difficult to conclude that Mr. Modi's popularity, which is undeniable, I would say, is the result of his performance. As GDP per capita is behind Bangladesh, China is in Ladakh. So if it is not on the basis of his performance, what else can we possibly ascribe it to? My view is that he personifies the sort of hard, cruel Hindutva that is popular. That the persecution of India's Muslims by the state is being rewarded by the majority.
So in a nutshell, you're saying that people vote for Modi because they identify with his anti-Muslim, anti-minority image. They believe this reflects their thinking and what they want.
I would say that is a fact, and certainly I think in year 7 we have seen that a performance cannot be the basis of why it is that he's popular.
Akar Patel, on that depressing, for some shocking note, thank you very much for this interview. Thank you very much for sharing and explaining your interpretation and analysis of Hindutva, which you firmly believe is not an ideology, it is a prejudice, and more specifically, it is an anti-Muslim prejudice. Take care.
Thank you for having me.
Stay safe.